Maya was 7 years old when her mother's medical bills became impossible to ignore. Sitting on the curb outside the Iron Forge, a biker bar on the edge of town, the girl spread her colored pencil drawings on a blanket, each one a desperate prayer. The sketches were simple: sunsets, flowers, stick figures holding hands, price tag $2 each. Most people walked past, some laughed. But when Garrett Reaper Morrison pulled up on his Harley that Tuesday evening, something shifted. He wasn't just a biker, he was a man who'd buried a daughter years ago, a man who'd made a promise to a dying friend that he'd never turn away from a child in need. One look at Maya's tear-stained face, and that promise roared back to life. By midnight, 54 bikers from the Hell's Oath chapter had gathered, not for violence, not for chaos, for something far more powerful: keeping a vow. What started as the purchase of drawings became a chain of small mercies: a tuition fund, a medical procedure, a second chance at normalcy. But honoring that promise would mean facing down a system designed to break families, corrupt officials who saw Maya's mother as an easy target, and the kind of quiet courage that changes everything. This is a story about the family you choose, the promises that never expire, and how 54 strangers became the answer to a little girl's prayer. If you've ever felt powerless watching someone struggle, you need to hear what these bikers did next. Don't miss this story. The afternoon sun painted the asphalt in shades of amber and rust as Maya sat cross-legged on the concrete curb outside the Iron Forge. Her small frame barely cast a shadow, just a slip of a girl in a faded denim jacket, her blonde hair tied back with a fraying purple ribbon. In front of her lay a white bedsheet, and on that sheet, arranged in careful rows, were her drawings. 37 of them. She'd counted twice. Each piece represented an hour of work, colored pencil on printer paper, some edges still curled from where she'd pressed too hard with her eraser, sunsets with impossible colors, flowers with petals like butterflies' wings, a series of stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Price, $2 per drawing. That's what the handwritten sign said. The letters wobbling slightly where her 7-year-old fingers had gripped the marker. $2 times 37 equaled $74. Not enough, but it was something. Her mother was working a double shift at the diner 3 miles away. Maya knew the schedule by heart, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., because she'd memorized it the same way other children memorized cartoon characters. She'd spent the morning at Mrs. Chen's house, the neighbor who watched her for free, pity evident in every glance, and the afternoon here, on this curb, waiting. The Iron Forge wasn't a place for children. Maya understood that much. The building was all weathered wood and faded paint, with a neon sign in the window that buzzed like an angry wasp. Through the smudged glass doors, she could hear the growl of voices, the clink of pool balls, the bass line of a song she didn't know. Motorcycles came and went throughout the day, massive machines that roared like dragons and smelled like burnt rubber and gasoline. But Mrs. Chen had said this was the best spot. Foot traffic, she'd explained, her voice carrying that mix of practicality and heartbreak that seemed to follow anyone who knew about Maya's situation. Bikers got money, and some of them got hearts too. A man walked past without stopping, then a woman with a cigarette behind her ear, then 3 teenagers who laughed and kept walking. Maya had learned not to make eye contact. She'd learned to smile even when the smile felt like a lie. She'd learned that the world was full of people who couldn't see her, or wouldn't, and that was just how things were. By 4 p.m., she'd sold 3 drawings. A woman had bought 2, their precious sweetie, and had given her $5 instead of 4. A man in work boots had bought one and asked if she did commissions. She didn't know what that meant, so she just shook her head. Now she had $9 in her pocket, folded into the smallest square possible and held against her ribs like a secret. $9 toward the $1,400 gap between what insurance would cover and what her mother owed the hospital. The sun was starting to angle lower when the motorcycle pulled up. Not like the others, loud and aggressive, but with a sound almost deliberate, controlled. The engine cut out with a mechanical sigh, and the man who swung his leg over the seat moved with the kind of weight that made the earth seem to settle beneath him. He was tall, scarred. His kutter, the denim vest covered in patches, marked him as Hell's Oath. The reaper patch on his back was faded but visible, a skeleton holding an hourglass. Beneath it, a rocker that read Sergeant at Arms. Garrett Morrison had earned that title through 23 years of loyalty to the club, through 1,000 small decisions to protect what mattered, and through one enormous failure he'd spent a decade trying to atone for. He didn't believe in signs or fate, but he also couldn't explain why he'd taken this route home instead of the highway, or why something in his chest had tightened the moment he saw the small figure on the curb. He approached slowly, his boots heavy on the sidewalk. Maya looked up, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "What have you got here, darling?" His voice was gravel and smoke, but gentle. The kind of gentle that came from understanding what it meant to be small in a world built for giants. Maya held up one of her drawings, a sunset, her best work. The colors bled into each other naturally, the horizon line perfectly level. $2, she whispered. Garrett knelt down, not standing over her but meeting her at eye level. He studied the drawing like it was a masterpiece hanging in a museum. His hands, scarred, calloused, capable of violence, held it with reverence. "This is real good work, little one," he said. "Tell me about it." Maya's eyes widened. Nobody ever asked her to explain. They just bought or they didn't. It's the sun going to sleep," she said softly, "and all the colors it leaves behind. Like promises it'll come back tomorrow." Something in Garrett's jaw tightened. For just a moment his eyes closed. When they opened again, they held the weight of 1,000 memories, of his daughter, Sarah, age 8, who'd loved sunsets and had stopped being 7 years old when a drunk driver ran a red light, of the promise he'd made at her grave, never turn away. Never pretend you didn't see. Never be silent when a child needs you. He looked at all 37 drawings spread across the bedsheet. "What's your name, darling?" "Maya," she answered. "I'm helping my mom. She's been sick a lot. The doctors cost a lot of money." Garrett stood slowly, his knees protesting slightly. He pulled out his phone and typed a single message to the Hell's Oath group chat. "Reaper here. Need the crew. Iron Forge. 1 hour. This one's personal." Then he turned back to Maya and did something that would echo through the next 9 chapters of her life, through 54 lives, through a town that would eventually learn what it meant when bikers decided to answer a child's prayer. He bought all 37 drawings. He paid in cash, $200, and told her to keep the change. "But that's not right," Maya said, confusion written across her small face. "No," Garrett replied, kneeling down again, his eyes holding hers with absolute certainty. "This is exactly right. You did good work. You deserve good money. And your mom's gonna be okay. I'm gonna make sure of it." He didn't know yet that his words would set off a chain reaction. He didn't know that within the hour the parking lot would fill with motorcycles. He didn't know that his promise, born from grief and redemption and the ghost of a daughter he'd loved, would spiral outward and touch lives he couldn't yet imagine. All he knew was that a little girl was selling her drawings on a curb, and somewhere in the architecture of his soul, a debt was finally coming due. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, indifferent to the small moment that had just changed everything. And now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. By 5:47 p.m., the parking lot of the Iron Forge had transformed into something between a gathering and a reckoning. Motorcycles lined the perimeter, Harleys mostly, some custom builds that gleamed like weapons in the fading light. The machines were arranged in careful rows, a visual statement of unity and purpose. Riders dismounted with the kind of synchronization that only came from years of brotherhood, their boots hitting the asphalt in near unison. 54 bikers by final count. Hell's Oath, chapter president down to the newest prospect, all responding to a message that contained no explanation, just a name and the code word, personal. Among the crew, personal meant something sacred. Inside the bar, the jukebox had been silenced. The pool balls sat undisturbed on felt-covered tables. Glasses remained unraised. Every eye in the place was trained on the two figures standing near the front window, Garrett Morrison and a small girl with a bedsheet of drawings at her feet. Marcus Priest Sullivan was the first to move. At 61, with silver threading through his beard and a limp from a shattered femur that had never fully healed, Priest had the kind of authority that came from survival. He'd buried 3 brothers in the club, 2 sons and a wife. He knew what real loss looked like, and he recognized it now in the angle of Garrett's shoulders. "All right," Priest said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like an axe. "Everybody listen up. Reaper called us here for a reason, so we listen." Garrett had been holding one of Maya's drawings, the sunset. He held it up, and even the newest members of the club, kids barely out of their teens, seemed to lean forward. "This is Maya," Garrett began. His voice was steady, but underneath it ran a current of something deeper, obligation, debt, the weight of promises kept and promises broken. "She's 7 years old. Her mother's medical bills have buried their family. So Maya sits on a curb and sells drawings for $2 each, trying to help, trying to be brave." He paused. Around the bar, riders exchanged glances. This wasn't unusual. The club had a standing protocol for families in crisis, but something in Reaper's delivery suggested this was different. This was personal in a way that demanded explanation. "I made a promise a long time ago," Garrett continued, "to someone I loved. I promised that if I ever saw a kid in need, I wouldn't walk past. I wouldn't pretend I didn't see. And I wouldn't be quiet about it." Priest understood immediately. The others followed seconds later, recognition spreading like a wave through the room. This was about redemption, about a debt that had been outstanding for over a decade. "So here's what we're gonna do," Garrett said. He held up the stack of cash he'd pulled from his wallet, $200, though that was just the beginning. "We're buying these drawings, every single one, and then we're going to find out exactly what Maya's family needs, and we're going to make sure they get it." A road captain named Vincent Tank Romano stepped forward. His massive frame, 6'4", 270 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, seemed to dwarf the small girl beside him. But when he knelt down, his movements were gentle, almost reverent. "Hey there, sweetie," he said to Maya. "I'm Tank. How much you need to make your mum feel better?" Maya's eyes were wide, taking in the room full of leather and patches and weathered faces. Some of these men had done time, some had killed, some had lost everything and clawed their way back, but to Maya, they were simply giants who'd appeared in her small world like an answer to prayers she didn't know she'd been praying. "The doctors say $1,400, she said quietly, "for a surgery. Mum says maybe next year we can save enough." $1,400. It was a fortune to the people in this room, men who lived paycheck to paycheck, who'd chosen the road over stability. But it was also nothing. It was a test, it was a threshold, it was a moment where 54 lives would collectively decide whether this child mattered. 1,400, Tank repeated, nodding slowly. He pulled out his phone and opened the Hell's Oath chapter account, a shared fund used for emergencies, medical crises, and moments exactly like this one. He typed a number and looked up at Garrett. "That sound right?" Garrett nodded. "That sound right to you, Maya?" That make things better for your mom?" The girl nodded, tears starting to form at the corners of her eyes. She didn't fully understand what was happening, only that the world had suddenly shifted, that adults who scared her, who looked dangerous, were looking at her like she was worth saving. What followed was chaos of the beautiful kind. Priest pulled out his card and made a donation. Tank did the same. One by one, the riders, bartenders and welders, mechanics and security guards, men who'd been to prison and men who'd never missed a day of work, stepped forward. Some gave $50, some gave $100, some gave $500 and didn't blink. By 6:15 p.m., the $1,400 goal had been met. By 6:30 p.m., it had been doubled. By 7 p.m., the Hell's Oath chapter account showed a deposit of $4,200, money earmarked for Maya's mother's surgery, recovery costs and whatever else emerged as a need. But the gathering wasn't finished. Priest walked to the center of the room, and every conversation stopped. When the chapter president spoke, the club listened. "This little girl came out here with nothing but her art and her courage," Priest began. "She showed us something today that we sometimes forget, that there's real strength in asking for help, that honesty matters, and that sometimes the smallest gestures come from the biggest hearts." He turned to Garrett. "Reaper, you knew what to do here. You remembered the promise. That's what brothers do. That's what this club means." Then he looked directly at Maya. "And you, darling, you didn't know it, but you just taught 54 people something important about themselves, that we can still be better, that we can still choose to help instead of hurt." Priest walked over and gently took one of Maya's remaining drawings. A flower, its petals rendered in impossible shades of purple and gold. He held it up. "This goes in the clubhouse," he said, "framed, where every member sees it every day and remembers that this is why we're here. Not for the road, not for the chaos. For moments like this, for kids like this one." By the time Maya's mother arrived to pick her up, confused, terrified, then overwhelmed when Garrett explained what had happened, the sun had nearly completed its descent. The light was amber and rose, exactly like one of the drawings the girl had created. 54 bikers stood in the parking lot, their machines creating a corridor for the small car to drive through. And as Maya and her mother drove away, every engine roared to life in a gesture of solidarity and blessing. Garrett stood among them, his eyes on the horizon, and felt the weight of that decade-old promise finally begin to lift. But the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Drop a comment with your location if you believe this actually happened somewhere. The internet thinks this is too good to be true. Maya's mother, Catherine, worked 3 jobs: the diner in the morning, the hospital at night, and weekend shifts at a grocery store that paid minimum wage. At 34 years old, she had the hands of a 60-year-old, cracked, calloused, stained with coffee and bleach. She had the eyes of someone who'd learned not to sleep, because sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. The medical bills had started 8 months ago when the crushing pain in her abdomen became impossible to ignore. Tests led to more tests. A diagnosis followed, a tumor, benign but large, pressing against her spine. Surgery was necessary. The window was closing, but the cost was astronomical, $14,000 before insurance. And even with insurance, her share was the amount she'd been told didn't exist in her world, so she'd decided to wait, to save, to hope that next year, or the year after, there would be room in a budget that barely covered rent and groceries for something as expensive as her own health. That's why she'd created the drawings with Maya. They'd started as a game, a way to spend time together, to create something, instead of staring at the blank walls of their apartment. But somewhere along the way, the drawings had become a mission. Maya had understood, with the clarity that children sometimes possess, that art could be currency, that creation could be survival. When Garrett had told her what happened, Catherine had wept. Not delicate tears, but the kind of sobs that came from understanding, for the first time in years, that she didn't have to carry this alone. But the universe, as it turned out, was more complicated than gratitude. 3 days later, Catherine received a call from her supervisor at the hospital, not to congratulate her on her upcoming surgery, but to schedule a meeting. The tone was official, careful, the kind of careful that meant complications. She sat in an office on the 4th floor, across from a woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, the hospital administrator, and beside her, a man in a suit who introduced himself as legal counsel. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Holloway began, her voice carrying the kind of sympathy that was actually pity, "we've become aware that you've received a substantial donation from an outside source. We need to discuss how this impacts your eligibility for hospital assistance programs." Catherine's stomach tightened. "I don't understand. The money was a gift from people in my community." "Yes," the man in the suit interjected. His name was Gregory Walsh, and he'd spent 23 years as corporate legal counsel, which meant he'd learned to turn words into weapons. A gift, which means it's income, which means it impacts your eligibility for needs-based assistance. The implication hung in the air like a bad smell. "What are you saying?" Catherine asked slowly. "We're saying," Dr. Holloway continued, and now her sympathy had taken on the edge of bureaucratic inevitability, "that because you now have the funds to cover the procedure, you're ineligible for the hospital's financial assistance program, which means you'll need to cover the full cost yourself, $14,800. Catherine felt the room tilt. "But I have $1,400. That's not enough for—" "No," Walsh interrupted. "The full surgical package. Anesthesia, facility fees, post-operative care, the works." It was legal. It was defensible. It was also exactly the kind of cruelty that operated within systems designed to protect themselves. The hospital had a fund for people who couldn't pay, but people who suddenly had money, even if that money wasn't enough, were no longer eligible for that fund. The logic was corporate, not human. Catherine left the office feeling like she'd been hollowed out. That night, she told Garrett, she'd gotten his number from a note Tank had left with an invoice for the drawings, professional, careful, but with an underlying message. "We're not disappearing. We're watching." Garrett listened to the entire explanation without interrupting. When Catherine finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Don't do anything," he finally said. "Don't sign anything. Don't pay anything. Just give us a day." Within the hour, Priest and 2 other senior members of Hell's Oath, Marcus Sullivan himself, along with a road captain named David Hammer Crenshaw, had arranged a meeting with the hospital board, not a meeting in a conference room with lawyers present. A meeting in Dr. Holloway's office, where 3 men in leather coats sat across from her desk and explained very calmly how their community had donated money to help a single mother, and how the hospital's response to that charity had been to create obstacles. "That's not our problem," Dr. Holloway said, though her voice was less certain now. "That's policy." "Policy changes," Priest replied. He was 61 years old with a grandfather's face and a killer's eyes. "Or this town starts to understand what happens when you punish people for accepting help." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. And Dr. Holloway, who'd worked in administration long enough to understand how much influence a community could wield, understood the message. But the system, Catherine would learn, had more layers than she'd realized. 3 days later, an official letter arrived. The hospital had reconsidered its position. Catherine would be allowed to use the donation toward the surgery cost, and the hospital's assistance program would cover the remainder. Catherine cried again, this time with something closer to relief. But Garrett, when she called to thank him, was quiet. "They only backed down because we pressured them," he said. "That's not how it should work. Medicine shouldn't be a negotiation between a patient and a club. It should be a right, but it's not. Not in this country. Not for people like you and me." It was the kind of clarity that came from being on the outside of systems for long enough to see their real shape. Maya's surgery was scheduled for November 15th, 2 weeks away. Catherine had stopped working the third job. The grocery store would give her medical leave. She was trying to prepare herself, to imagine a future where she didn't wake up every morning in pain. But she was also aware, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, that something had shifted, that the kindness shown to her family had set off a cascade of events that wasn't finished yet, that the hospital, even after backing down, was probably not finished maneuvering. Garrett felt it too. He'd spent 23 years in the club, learning to read situations the way other men read books, and he recognized the shape of a system fighting back, fighting to maintain control, fighting to ensure that charity remained small, contained, unable to challenge the larger architecture of power. On the eve of Catherine's surgery, Garrett sat in the clubhouse, the Iron Forge, and made a decision. Not alone, but in consultation with Priest and the other senior members. A decision that would expand this story far beyond one woman and one little girl. A decision to teach the system a lesson. The sun set outside the bar windows, painting the sky in impossible shades of purple and gold, the colors of Maya's flowers, the colors of hope that had been earned rather than inherited. If you're watching this from the East Coast, it's probably around 11:47 p.m. right now. What would you do in Garrett's position? Drop a comment. I need to know your thoughts before Chapter 4. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it moves through certain channels. Within a week of Maya's surgery being approved, 3 other families came forward. Not because they were greedy, but because they understood finally that there might be someone willing to listen. A single father whose daughter needed corrective lenses for school, insurance wouldn't cover it. A widow whose son had asthma so severe he missed half of 3rd grade. An elderly man whose medication for his heart condition had just doubled in price. None of them had expected anything. They'd learned, over years of struggling, to expect very little. But the story of Maya, a 7-year-old selling drawings on a curb, and 54 bikers answering that call, had spread like a seed scattered on good ground. Garrett didn't turn them away. He sat with each family, listened to their stories, and then brought them to the club. By the 2nd meeting, 30 members contributed. By the 4th, it was nearly the entire chapter. But Garrett understood something crucial. This couldn't be a series of individual interventions. It had to become something structural, something that didn't depend on a child's artwork or a biker's conscience. It had to become a system that served people instead of punishing them. So he and Priest did something that should have been simple, but in the landscape of American charity was revolutionary. They created a foundation. The Iron Oath Foundation was officially registered as a 501c3 non-profit. Its stated purpose: to provide medical, educational, and basic wellness support to families in crisis within a 50-mile radius. Its funding: Hell's Oath. Chapter members: some local businesses that understood the value of community investment, and a growing network of individual donors who'd heard about the girl with drawings. The foundation was housed in a small office on Main Street, staffed partially by volunteers and partially by a single employee, a retired social worker named Maria Gonzalez, who'd spent 30 years watching systems fail people and was ready to build something different. Within 2 months, the foundation had helped 12 families with medical emergencies, 8 children with educational needs, 4 elderly people with housing instability, 2 domestic violence survivors with emergency relocation. The numbers were small in the context of national poverty statistics, but in a town of 12,000 people, they were seismic. People began to understand that help was possible. That community could be more than a word, but there were people who didn't appreciate what was happening. The hospital administrator, Dr. Holloway, watched with increasing frustration as her authority was being circumvented. Patients who would have previously accepted whatever her office decided were now showing up with documents from the Iron Oath Foundation, challenging billing practices, demanding itemized statements, refusing to accept debt as inevitable. More concerning, other organizations began to take notice. Community hospitals in neighboring towns started fielding calls from local bikers asking why their hospitals had similar policies, why people in crisis had to disappear from assistance programs the moment they received outside help, why the system seemed designed to ensure that poor people stayed poor. The pressure was subtle but consistent, and pressure applied consistently has a way of creating cracks in systems that appeared monolithic. 3 months after Maya's first surgery, Dr. Holloway received a letter from the hospital's board. They were implementing new financial assistance policies, more generous, more forgiving, policies that didn't penalize patients for accepting charitable donations. It was a victory, but Garrett knew it was the smallest of victories. The larger battle, the one being fought in state legislatures and federal courts, was still happening. But in this town, in this moment, something had shifted. On the day of Maya's follow-up appointment, 6 weeks post-surgery, cleared to return to school full-time without pain, Catherine brought her daughter to the clubhouse. Not for a meeting, but just to say thank you, to put a face on gratitude. 53 riders were present. Garrett was running an errand. They gathered around the little girl, this child who'd started a revolution with colored pencil and courage. "We got something for you," Tank said, kneeling down. He held up a leather vest, small enough for a 7-year-old, with a single patch on the back. Not an official rocker, but something close. A drawing of a flower, rendered professionally in full color. Beneath it, words stitched in white, "Iron Oath Protector." Maya's eyes went wide. She slipped the vest on, it fit perfectly, and looked up at the sea of weathered, scarred faces surrounding her. "Does this mean I'm part of the club?" she asked. Priest stepped forward and placed his hand on her small shoulder. "It means your family," he said simply. "It means this club and this town has your back, no matter what, forever." Later, when the photographers came, the local news had picked up the story by then. The image that circulated was simple but powerful. A 7-year-old girl in a leather vest too large for her, standing between Priest and Garrett, surrounded by 53 men who'd learned that sometimes the most radical thing a person could do was refuse to look away. But the Foundation's work was just beginning. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in Maria Gonzalez's inbox. It was from an attorney representing the Riverside County Medical Association, a coalition of hospitals and doctors across a 5-county region. The message was both professional and threatening. The Iron Oath Foundation, it argued, was operating outside the regulatory framework designed to protect the integrity of the healthcare system. More specifically, it was interfering with legitimate billing practices and creating a parallel system of accountability that undermined established protocol. In simpler terms, the Foundation was dangerous because it worked. Garrett received the email at the clubhouse and read it twice. The legalese was designed to obscure, but the message was clear: stop or face litigation. He called a meeting. Not just chapter officers, but the full membership. 63 riders stood in the warehouse that served as their official clubhouse, and Garrett told them the truth. They had 3 options. 1, shut down the Foundation. Pretend the last 4 months hadn't happened. Return to the old way of doing things. Individual interventions, no systemic challenge. 2, face a lawsuit they couldn't afford, brought by lawyers far more expensive than anything the club could counter. They'd likely lose. The foundation would be dismantled anyway. 3. Go deeper. Expand. Make the foundation so visible, so embedded in the community fabric, that destroying it would require more political capital than the medical association was willing to spend. The club voted unanimously for option 3. What followed was a coordinated effort that would have been impressive if it hadn't also been terrifying to the people in power. The foundation began accepting donations not just from club members, but from local businesses. A mechanic shop donated a percentage of profits. A restaurant chain offered free meals for foundation volunteers. A local attorney offered pro bono legal services. More importantly, other communities began replicating the model. Within 6 months, 3 other towns had established similar foundations, all affiliated with their local Hell's Oath chapters. The network was growing. The Medical Association's lawsuit was filed in late March. It alleged unfair business practices, interference with legitimate healthcare operations, and in a particularly absurd claim, gang activity masquerading as charity. Garrett expected to lose, but he'd also learned something crucial over the past months. Sometimes losing in court was the least important victory. The lawsuit became news. Local news first, then regional, then, because the internet amplifies everything, national. News anchors covering the story had to confront an uncomfortable reality. A motorcycle club was providing healthcare support that the government hadn't, that hospitals were resisting efforts to make medical care more equitable, and that the system's response to being challenged was to use lawyers and litigation. It didn't matter that the Medical Association eventually won. They did. The judge ruled that the foundation, while admirable, had overstepped certain boundaries. By the time the verdict came down, public opinion had shifted so dramatically that enforcing it became politically untenable. Hospitals began changing their policies anyway. Insurance companies began working with foundations like the Iron Oaths. State legislators began introducing bills designed to protect patients from retroactive assistance program disqualification. What had started with a little girl selling drawings on a curb had become a blueprint for challenging an entire system. But there was a cost. 3 members of the club faced federal investigations into unrelated matters. Not because they'd done anything wrong in connection with the foundation, but because investigations are what authorities reach for when they want to punish people who've become inconvenient. The DEA showed up at the clubhouse with search warrants. Tax investigators audited chapter members' personal finances. It was harassment dressed in legal language, and it was effective. Some members got scared. One left the club entirely. Garrett absorbed this. He'd expected it. The system, when challenged, often responded with violence dressed as bureaucracy. But he also understood something that surprised him. The foundation was bigger than the club now. It wasn't just bikers anymore. It was social workers, doctors who'd grown disgusted with their profession's inequities, community activists, and ordinary people who recognized that charity was less important than justice. On the day the lawsuit verdict came down, Garrett and Priest sat in a small office at the foundation and read the judge's ruling. It was harsh, dismissive, and designed to sound authoritative. "So we lost," Priest said quietly. "We lost the lawsuit," Garrett replied. He was reading an email from the hospital administrator, Dr. Holloway, who just announced that the hospital was implementing new medical justice training for all staff. But look at what we won. Look at what actually changed. He pulled up data on the computer. In the 4-county region served by affiliated foundations, hospital debt had dropped by 32% among low-income families. Emergency room admissions had fallen by 12%. People were getting preventive care earlier. 3 former hospital administrators had been forced to resign over objections to the discrimination they'd previously been implementing. Small numbers in the context of national healthcare, but in these towns, In these lives, in this corner of America, systems had changed. Priest leaned back and nodded slowly. "You did it," he said to Garrett. "You honored that promise. You did something with it." Garrett thought about his daughter, about the promise made at a grave, about how the universe worked sometimes, how honoring a debt to the dead could unexpectedly reshape the lives of the living. "We did it," he corrected Priest gently. "All of us. That's the only reason it worked." 2 years passed. They moved quickly, filled with ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. Maya, now 9 years old, had become a straight A student. More importantly, she was healthy. The surgery had changed her life, literally changed it, removing the tumor that had been slowly stealing her mother's future. Catherine worked just 2 jobs now, was taking night classes to become a nurse herself, and had developed a kind of quiet contentment that comes from knowing you'll survive. But Maya's real education happened elsewhere. Every week, she volunteered at the Iron Oath Foundation office, not filing papers, she was too young, but greeting people who came in needing help. She'd learned to listen, to understand that everyone's crisis felt enormous to the person experiencing it. She'd learned the language of bureaucracy and the poetry of compassion, and she'd kept drawing. Her artistic work had developed considerably. Gallery owners were starting to take notice. One had offered to show her work, a series of 40 paintings exploring the concept of chosen family, each one depicting a character from the Foundation story in oils and acrylics. But the real turning point came in the fall of her 3rd year of post-surgery recovery. A news outlet, the New York Times Magazine, published a feature story titled, "How One Motorcycle Club Changed American Healthcare." The article traced the history of the Iron Oath Foundation, starting with a photograph of a small girl selling drawings on a curb. It detailed the journey from that moment to where the foundation stood now, operating in 7 states, having helped over 8,000 families, and having directly influenced healthcare policy reform in 2 states. The story made Garrett Morrison famous. Television networks wanted interviews. He declined most of them, but he did one, a single conversation with a public radio journalist, where he talked about promises, about what it meant to honor a debt to someone who died, about how a child's courage could reshape the world if enough people chose to pay attention. In that interview, he mentioned his daughter once. He didn't name her, but he described a girl who'd loved sunsets, whose death had broken him, and whose memory had pushed him toward a woman and child selling art on a curb on a Tuesday evening. After the interview aired, something unexpected happened. The club, Hell's Oath, the organization that had been painted as dangerous for so long, became a symbol of something positive. Other motorcycle clubs began establishing similar foundations. The outlaw motorcycle community, which for generations had been associated with violence and crime, suddenly found itself at the center of a conversation about justice and community. Not all of them leaned into it, but many did. Within a year, 17 separate motorcycle club chapters had established health and social justice foundations in their regions. The movement, started by a man honoring a dead child, was spreading. Garrett watched this happen with something between satisfaction and disorientation. He'd never intended to be a symbol. He'd just tried to keep a promise. On the day that the Times article was published, Priest threw a party at the clubhouse. All 63 members were present, plus staff from the foundation, plus local community members who'd become part of the Hell's Oath extended family. Maya arrived wearing a new dress her mother had sewn, and her face was radiant with the kind of joy that comes from seeing something you love become bigger than you'd imagined possible. Priest stood up and raised a glass. 2 years ago, we gathered in this room to help one family, he said. Tonight, we're celebrating the fact that we've helped 8,000, and the night's still young. The room erupted in cheers. Later, when the crowd had dispersed and only the senior officers remained, Garrett pulled up a video on his phone. It was from a hospital in Tennessee, a facility that had adopted the Iron Oath Foundation model. In the video, a mother was being discharged after emergency surgery. No debt, no crushing medical bills, just recovery. "She doesn't know who we are," the hospital administrator said in the video. "She doesn't know about the club or the foundation. She just knows she gets to go home and live her life without being crushed by debt. That's what your work has made possible." Priest watched the video and then placed a hand on Garrett's shoulder. "That promise you made," he said quietly, "I think it's been kept." Garrett nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "I want you to know something. When I made that promise to Sarah, when I stood over her grave and said I wouldn't turn away, I meant it. I wanted to keep it, but I didn't know how. I didn't think a man like me could change anything. I thought the promise would just be something I carried forever without ever really fulfilling it." "But," Priest prompted. "But then a 7-year-old sold drawings on a curb," Garrett continued, "and that act of courage gave me permission to be courageous too. That's what I want people to understand about this story. It's not about how an old biker saved a family. It's about how a child's faith in the possibility of kindness created the conditions for 54 strangers to become family. That's the real magic. That's what changed the world, not the bikers, the child's courage. Everyone else just had the good sense to listen." Hit that like button if you believe that one act of courage can ripple across an entire system. I need to know this is landing for you before we finish this story. On a cold November morning, exactly 2 years after the first day on the curb, a letter arrived at the clubhouse. It was addressed to Garrett, but the handwriting was distinctive, small, careful, deliberately formed by hands, still learning their own strength. It was from Maya. Garrett opened it slowly, aware that this moment mattered. That this letter, written by a 9-year-old girl to a man who'd changed her world, was going to mean something significant. "Dear Garrett, Mrs. Chen told me I should write a thank you letter to important people in my life. She said thank you letters are how we tell people their actions mattered. So I'm writing to you. I remember the day on the curb. I remember how scared I was that no one would buy my drawings. I remember thinking that maybe I wasn't good enough or brave enough, or that my art didn't matter. And then you came. You didn't just buy drawings. You told me I mattered. You told me my mum mattered. You told me that there were other people in the world who understood that when someone is suffering, you don't walk past. Mom says that what you did changed everything for us. I understand that now. I see it when she comes home smiling instead of crying. I see it in the way she talks about her future like it's real instead of just a dream. I see it in the way she looks at me like she's proud, not just relieved. But I also know that you did this because someone told you to, not like a boss telling you, but like your heart telling you. Mom told me about your daughter. I'm sorry she's not here anymore. But I want you to know that I think she would be proud of what you're doing in her name. When I grow up, I want to do what you do. I want to keep promises, not just to people I know, but to people I'll never meet. Because that's what real promises are, right? Not just the ones that are easy, the ones that are hard, the ones that take courage. Thank you for buying my drawings. Thank you for buying my mom's health. Thank you for showing me that the world can be kind even when it's scary. Love, Maya P.S. I'm entering my paintings in an art competition next month. The theme is Unexpected Family. I'm painting the day you met me on the curb. I hope I win because I want to donate the prize money to the foundation. Because now I understand. That's how promises grow. Garrett read the letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading, his hands were shaking. He called an immediate meeting, not with the club, but with Priest, Tank, and the foundation director. He read the letter aloud, and when he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. "That girl," Tank finally said, just taught us the most important lesson yet." "What's that?" Priest asked. "That this isn't about us saving them," Tank replied. "It's about them saving themselves, and us having the sense to get out of the way and let them." Garrett added the letter to the Foundation's archives, not because it was signed by a child, but because it articulated something that all their philosophy and policy documents had been dancing around. The Foundation wasn't just about intervention, it was about creating conditions where people could honor their own promises. The art competition happened on a Saturday in December. 300 local artists entered work. The judges, a selection of curators from regional museums, walked through the venue, studying paintings and sculptures and installations. When they came to Maya's work, they stopped. The painting depicted exactly what she'd described, a small girl sitting on a curb with drawings spread before her, and in the composition you could see the approaching figure of a man on a motorcycle, but the genius of the painting was in the negative space. The area around the figures suggested the presence of dozens more. Bikers, community members, strangers about to become family. The title, written on a small brass plate below the frame, read, "The Moment Before Everything Changed." It won first prize. The award came with a $10,000 grant to the artist or an organization of her choice. Maya stood in front of her painting at the awards ceremony, a girl now in 5th grade, no longer afraid, no longer desperate, and announced that the prize would go to the Iron Oath Foundation. The room erupted in applause. Later at the foundation office, Maya presented a ceremonial check to Priest. She was radiant. Her mother was beside her, crying. 60 bikers were packed into the small office, standing room only, all of them witnessing this moment. "This money," Maya said, reading from a prepared statement that she'd written herself, "is going to help other kids like me. Other kids who are scared, other kids who think nobody will listen. But they're wrong. Because people will listen. People care. All you have to do is be brave enough to ask." Garrett stood in the back, watching the child who'd started this revolution stand in her own power, speak her own truth, honor her own promise. He thought about his daughter, about the grave where he'd made that original vow. And he understood something that grief had been teaching him for years, that keeping a promise to someone who's died isn't about preventing their absence. It's about channeling their life force into something that matters. That's what Maya had done for him. That's what she'd done for everyone in this room. She'd taught them that promises aren't burdens, they're gifts, they're invitations to become more than we thought we could be. The words spread through the biker community like wildfire through dry brush. Not because anyone announced it, but because news moves fast when it's important, when it matters. The motorcycle clubs, not all of them associated with Hell's Oath, began reaching out. Clubs from California, Texas, Florida, New York. Clubs that had spent generations being painted as criminals, gang members, dangers to society. They wanted to know about the foundation model. They wanted to understand how a community-based approach to social justice could work within the framework of their existing brotherhood. Priest and Garrett began traveling. Not all the time. The local foundation still needed leadership, but regularly enough that they became familiar figures at rallies and chapter meetings across the country. What they found was something beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a movement beginning to form, a nationwide network of motorcycle clubs, diverse in almost every way, united by a single principle, that promises mattered, that honoring those promises could reshape communities, that the powerful machines they rode didn't have to be weapons, they could be vehicles for transformation. But not everyone was happy about this. Federal law enforcement agencies began investigating the network more aggressively, not for criminal activity, there was none to find, but for potential gang coordination. The theory was that if all these separate clubs were cooperating on social justice initiatives, that cooperation must have a darker purpose. It was absurd, and everyone knew it. But absurdity, when backed by federal authority, is still dangerous. Garrett was called to testify before a Senate committee investigating organized motorcycle crime. He sat at a table with harsh lights and hostile faces, and he told the story from the beginning. The promise to his daughter, the girl on the curb, the foundation, the thousands of families helped. "With respect, Senator," Garrett said, when asked whether the coordinated efforts of multiple motorcycle clubs represented a threat, "I think you've got it backwards. The threat isn't what we're doing. The threat is what was happening before. A system where a child has to sell her art just to help her mother survive. A system where medical debt destroys families. A system where the powerful can ignore the powerless and call it policy." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "What we're doing, what these clubs are doing, isn't a conspiracy. It's a reclamation. We're reclaiming the possibility that communities can care for their own, that people matter more than profit. That keeping your word is more important than obeying a system designed to break promises." The hearing was televised. Clips went viral. One moment in particular, Garrett's voice steady, his eyes direct, became iconic. A man in a motorcycle club cooter, speaking truth to power and not backing down. The federal investigation eventually went nowhere. The evidence didn't exist because there was nothing to investigate, but the public relations victory was enormous. The image of motorcycle clubs as dangerous outlaws began to erode in the cultural consciousness. What emerged in its place was more complex, more human, more true. Back in the town where it had all started, the changes were visible everywhere. The school had created an art program, partially funded by the Iron Oath Foundation, that now served 30 kids with scholarships. The hospital had established a patient advocacy office, specifically designed to ensure that families like Catherine's didn't get crushed by bureaucracy. A community centre was being built in the warehouse district, funded by donations from club members and local businesses. And Maya, now 11 years old, in 6th grade, a celebrated young artist, had become something unexpected, a symbol, not of what motorcycle clubs could do, but of what communities could do when they stopped accepting cruelty as inevitable. Her second exhibition of paintings had just opened at a regional museum. The theme this time was Chosen Family, stories of people who'd been rejected or abandoned by blood relations, but who'd found belonging in unexpected places. One painting depicted Tank, the massive biker who'd first purchased drawings, sitting in a coffee shop with an elderly man who'd been homeless before the foundation helped him. Another showed a community centre filled with faces, a mosaic of the town, united. At the opening, Garrett stood with Priest and watched a room full of art collectors, academics and media figures study the work of a young girl who'd learned something essential about the world. The transformation starts with seeing clearly, bearing witness, and then choosing to act. "You know what I think?" Priest said quietly, standing beside Garrett. "What's that?" "I think your daughter did this," Priest said. "Not through you, but through you. Like you were the vessel, and her love was what moved through you into the world." Garrett didn't respond immediately. He was watching Maya across the room, speaking to an older woman about one of her paintings. The girl had confidence now. She had safety. She had faith in a world that had proven itself worthy of faith. "Maybe," he finally said. "Or maybe that's just what promises are. They're the way the dead stay alive in us, the way love refuses to die." 5 years later, Maya, now 16 years old, stood on the steps of a community centre that bore a small bronze plaque. The Iron Oath Community Centre, dedicated to the principle that all children matter. She was filming her first major documentary, not about the foundation exactly, but about her journey from that curb to this moment, about what it meant to grow up knowing that the world had chosen to help you, and about what that meant for how she wanted to live. Garrett was 63 years old now. His beard had more silver than black. His hands had become gentler over the years, the violence that lived in them subdued by decades of choosing other options. He still rode. He still wore his kuta with the reaper patch. But he also sat on the board of the foundation. He wrote op-eds about healthcare reform. He'd become unexpectedly a voice of authority on community organizing and social justice. More importantly, he'd become a grandfather figure to a generation of kids who'd learned about the power of promises. Priest had retired from his position as chapter president. Tank had taken the role, along with the responsibility of managing the expanded foundation network that now operated in 12 states. The work that had started in one small town had become something that defied easy categorization. Not quite a non-profit, not quite an activist network, but something new. Something that emerged when communities decided they mattered more than systems. Catherine Chen, Maya's mother, had finished her nursing degree and now worked at the hospital that had once tried to deny her charity. She was part of the patient advocacy team, helping other families navigate the same medical bureaucracy that had nearly destroyed her. On a bright October afternoon, with the leaves turning and the air carrying the first hints of winter, Garrett rode out to the curb where it had all begun. The location had changed slightly. The biker bar had expanded, renovated, become respectable. But the curb was still there, the same concrete where a desperate child had spread her art like a prayer. A small memorial had been placed there, a simple marker with words etched in granite. The beginning, a promise, a child, a community. Beneath it, dates, the year they'd found each other. Garrett sat down on that curb and did something he hadn't done since his daughter's funeral. He cried. Not from pain, but from gratitude. Not from loss, but from understanding that loss, when honored properly, could be transformed into something living. He thought about Sarah, about the promise made over her grave, about the winding path that promise had taken through time and chance and human choice, about how one small vow to a dead child had somehow reached into the future and changed the lives of thousands. Later that evening, a gathering happened, not planned, but inevitable. The word had spread through the biker community. Garrett's at the curb. And riders began to appear. Not just Hell's Oath members, but bikers from other clubs, other states, other chapters of the network that had grown from that single moment. By sunset, nearly 100 motorcycles lined the street. Riders stood quietly, honoring the space that mattered, honoring the promise that had started it all. Priest was there, leaning heavily on a cane now, his health beginning its slow decline. Tank was there, the responsibility of leadership visible in his bearing. Maria Gonzalez from the foundation was there, as were doctors and nurses and social workers who'd committed their professional lives to the movement that had started with a girl and her drawings. And Maya was there, 16-year-old Maya, who'd grown up knowing that her artwork had changed the world. She held her mother's hand and looked at the memorial, at the gathering of bikers, at the sun setting in impossible colors. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Garrett asked her quietly, standing beside her while the others honored the moment in their own ways. "Every day," Maya said simply. "Not because I'm sad about it anymore, but because it reminds me that courage, real courage, isn't about being brave. It's about doing what matters even when you're scared. You taught me that, all of you taught me that." Garrett nodded slowly. "Your drawings," he said, "they started all of this. You know that, right? Not just because you created them, but because they asked a question. They asked if the world was kind, and enough people said yes to make it true." Maya looked up at him, And in her eyes he could see the child she'd been and the woman she was becoming. "I'm going to keep asking that question," she said, "my whole life. I'm going to create things and ask if the world is kind, and I'm going to trust that sometimes people will prove the answer is yes." As the sun finished its descent, the riders began a ritual that had developed over the years. They started their motorcycles, not aggressively, but ceremonially. The sound rose, not a weapon, but a song. A chorus of engines that spoke to something ancient in the human spirit, the power of community, the strength of promises, the possibility of transformation. Garrett watched it all from the curb where it had started and felt the weight he'd carried for 15 years, the promise to his daughter, finally settle into something different. Not a burden anymore, but a legacy. Not a debt anymore, but a gift that he'd been given permission to pass forward. The motorcycles began to move, riding slowly through the town where they'd learned that promises mattered. Past the hospital that had been forced to change its policies, past the community center that bore their principles in bronze, past the homes of families they'd helped, past the school where a generation of children had learned that strangers could become family. And at the front of the procession, a young girl rode behind her adoptive grandfather, because that's what Garrett had become. The family Maya had chosen. A girl who'd learned that the world could be kind. A girl who'd learned to keep promises. A girl whose colored pencil and courage had reshaped the world. The sound of their motorcycles echoed through the town as darkness fell. And somewhere in the architecture of the universe, a promise made over a grave 15 years ago was finally, fully, completely kept. Thank you for riding with us on this journey. If this story changed how you think about promises, community, and the power of one act of courage, please like and subscribe. More stories like this are coming. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message right now, send them this video. We're building something bigger than ourselves, just like Garrett and Maya did. See you in the next one.